Unit 2 is on biodiversity. So what we're going to look at in this first module is kind of a little bit of background information on what biodiversity is and why it's important. So starting with the definition, biodiversity is simply the variety of life on Earth. And we can further divide it into three different categories. The first scale of biodiversity is genetic diversity, which is genetic variation among individuals in a population. Now, a population deals with individuals of the same species living in a certain area. So, for example, we have human genetic diversity. In the image in the background here, you see a map of indigenous skin colors, and we would have different genetic variation or different gene pools in different areas of the world, and that leads to genetic diversity. So the gene pool is the range of genetic material that's present within a species. So each individual of a species has a slightly different set of genes from any other individual. So for example, in this picture here, we see our frog population. They're a population because they're all individuals of the same species, but each frog is slightly different. They have different genetic makeup. Some are green, some are red, some are purple. And you can see that if we take all of the genetic material in each of the frogs and combine it, that is our gene pool. Now, many species don't all live in one area. They're spread out, and we have different populations of the same species. So each population tends to have a different gene pool or different genetic makeup. Now, the more diverse a population or the greater that gene pool, the better that it can respond to any environmental stressors. And some examples of these could be something that causes physical stress, like a natural disaster, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes. Wildfires would be another example of an environmental stressor, pollution, thermal stress, which would be extreme heat or extreme cold. And that also, another example would be climatic, where different amounts of sunlight, different temperature can cause stress on an organism. Radiation, or even biological stressors like predator-prey relationships, competition, whether it's inter or intra-specific, over resources, parasitism, a lack of finding a mate. All right, something else that can affect the gene pool is something we call the bottleneck effect, and it can lead to a loss of genetic diversity over time. So what happens, you have your original population, there is some bottleneck event, like a famine, again, when there are natural disasters or drought, that only allows certain members of that population to survive. Maybe they have a certain genetic makeup that allows them to withstand certain events or certain stressors. So that surviving population, now we have a smaller gene pool. When they reproduce and pass along their traits, the new population still has that smaller gene pool, so we have less genetic diversity. So if you compare the first and the last bottle there, the original population to the new population, you could see that decrease in genetic diversity. All right, our second category of biodiversity is species diversity. So we're zooming out a little bit, and we're looking at the number of different species in a region or a habitat. And an ecosystem that has a larger number of species or a greater species diversity is going to be more likely to recover from disruptions or environmental stressors. So when we're talking about species diversity, what is a species? A species is a group of organisms who can interbreed and produce viable offspring. Like a horse and a horse can interbreed and produce viable offspring. A horse and a donkey can interbreed and produce a mule, but a mule cannot have a baby mule. So that would not be considered a species. All right, so if we look at the total number of species, only 2 million have been identified and cataloged as scientists, but estimates of the total number of species range anywhere from 5 to 100 million. most scientists estimate there's about 10 million species on Earth. And you can see from that chart there some examples of a variety of species. All right, the third type, we're zooming out even further. We've gone from genetic diversity within individuals of a species. We've had species diversity, which is the number of different species. And then zooming out even more, we have habitat diversity or ecosystem diversity. And that's the variety of habitats that exist within a given region. And I chose California as our example here, and you can see the variety of habitats that are found in that one state. All right, within habitats, we have generalist species and we have specialist species. We've talked a little bit about this in Unit 1. But a generalist species is one that can live under a wide range of both biotic and abiotic conditions. So they tend to be able to survive in a wider range of areas with different types of resources. Whereas a specialist species has a very narrow range of tolerance or range of conditions, or like our panda and koala here, they feed on a very small group of species. And just because pandas are the cutest for your viewing pleasure. All right, now a lot of our island species have evolved to be specialists, not generalists, because there are limited resources on islands, whether that's food or space. And so what happens if you have any invasive or non-native species on these islands, the survival of the specialists is jeopardized because these invasive species, which are typically generalists, can outcompete the specialists. All right, also looking at specialists and generalists. Specialists tend to be the first that are affected by a change. So loss of habitat is the number one cause of our decreasing diversity of species. So we're going to start losing the specialist species first and then followed by generalist. Also, if you have a species that has a large territory that it covers, loss of habitat can lead to reduced numbers of those species as well. All right, if we want to compare diversity between different ecosystems, generally we're looking at two things: the number of different species, which is known as species richness, or the number of individuals of each species, which we call species evenness. So we compare those two factors. So looking at these two communities, both communities have the same number of species, but the spread is not as even. So if I am, it's not showing up. But if I'm looking at those two, community 1, we would say, would be more diverse because it has both richness and evenness. All right, similar to this figure, both community A and community B have the same number of species, so the same richness, but community B has greater species evenness, so we would say it is more diverse. All right, so why is it important to compare the diversity of two different ecosystems? One of the reasons is we can determine or see the effect of human impact if we're comparing two ecosystems, or the impact of some biotic and abiotic factors. So what we do is we need to come up with a number of diversity so we can compare the two ecosystems. One way that we can express diversity as a number is using Simpson's diversity index. And this is what we're using in class when we do our parking lot diversity activity. So the Simpson's index takes into account both species richness and evenness. So capital N is the total number of individuals. So that gives us the species richness. And then the lowercase n is the number of individuals of each species. So that gives us the species evenness. We plug into the formula, we get two numbers. We can compare those numbers. So if you want to, pause and see if you can figure out which of these two species has a greater diversity. Now you could probably tell by looking at the numbers. Both communities have the same number of flower species. one is more even than the other. So plug those numbers into the diversity index and see what you get as a result. Now, when you're comparing ecosystems, what does that D or that diversity index actually tells us? If you have a higher number, that means that your ecosystem is more stable. So chances are it's been around for a very long time. If you have a low value of D or a lower diversity, then generally that means something has happened to that ecosystem. Either there's some sort of pollution, recent colonization, or agriculture that has been introduced into that area. Usually when we use Simpson's index, it's to study vegetation, but it can be used for all types of species diversity. All right, also in your module, in the reading, you're going to be looking at island biogeography, and we will be taking a closer look at what that is in class.